I was chatting with a friend recently and the topic of money came up. And I asked him, how are you managing your finances? And what he told me kind of shocked me. One, he mentioned that he saves most of his money in cash. He also mentioned that he has a financial advisor through his family, that he doesn't really understand that relationship. He mentioned that he kind of understands tax-free accounts, but he doesn't think that he's using them properly. And last but not least, he mentioned that he does not want to think about his finances actively. Does any of that sound like you? Having this conversation made me realize that a lot of you out there are at different stages in your wealth building journey. So today's video, I'm going to try to capture what I like to call the 5 levels of investing. And in true wealth potion fashion, we are going to treat building wealth like a video game, because not only is that going to make it more fun, but it's going to make it easier to understand each of these levels and how we can progress through them to achieve financial freedom. And by the way, because I'm condensing all 5 levels into this one video, it's going to be a bit of a crash course. But in the future, I'm going to deep dive into each one of these levels to provide a broader picture of what the level is like, what some of the bosses are, and how you can go from this level to the next level. Let me know in the comments. Tell me which level you're currently in and what level you'd like to achieve in 2025. And so without further ado, let's dive in. The first level, I'm actually going to call level 0, because some of you will be lucky enough to skip this level, and many of us have to go through this level. And that level is debt. A lot of us will start our careers in debt, largely because of student loans. Now, if you got help from family or friends, or you were really diligent and you worked through high school to pay for college, or if you skip college altogether, then maybe you don't have any debt. And in that case, you can skip to level 1. But I would say the majority of us in Millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, we unfortunately have to start our video game in level 0. You can think of debt as tutorial island, if you will. Some people will be able to skip the tutorial and jump right in, but many of us have to slog through the tutorial. Now, the way that we beat level 0 and get off of tutorial island is super simple. We need to pay off our debt ASAP. Now, in the deep dive on level 0, we are going to talk about the different kinds of debt and why in some scenarios you might not want to pay off your debt right away, but in the majority of cases you want to pay off that debt. The reason for this, by the way, has to do with interest rates. The interest rate on your debt is how much you are paying every year for that loan. For example, if I borrow $1,000 for a student loan, my interest rate might be 5%. So every year I pay $50 to have that loan. If instead it's a credit card debt, the interest might be 20%. So every year I'm paying $200 on that $1,000 loan. We'll cover this in more detail in the deep dive on debt, but in most cases you want to pay off your debt as soon as possible. And one of the big reasons, regardless of the interest rate, is simply for peace of mind. It would be like jumping into the video game and those tutorial tips keep popping up on the screen. I mean, you could play the game that way, but you might start to get stressed out because you have this debt looming over you. So for most people, the simple answer is just pay off the debt as soon as possible. First, you need to write down, perhaps in a spreadsheet, all of the different debts you have. Credit card debt, car loan, student loan, etc. Total them up. Then you need to start working through a plan to pay off that debt. Again, something we'll cover more in the deep dive. That is how we beat level 0. We pay off our debt. And once we're debt free, we can really start to think about level 1. Level 1 is all about saving cash. And this is where I mentioned my friend earlier is. And unfortunately, a lot of people I speak with are stuck in level 1. What is level 1? To be more specific, it's you're making money from your job and you're paying off your expenses and your debt, but then any additional money you have from that income, you are just putting in the bank account as cash. There is a big problem with this, and this is a topic we've talked about a lot on Wealth Potion, which is inflation. To put it really simply, inflation slowly but surely eats away at the value of your cash. You may have heard some stories of like boomers or your grandparents or even your parents buying a house, say in 1975 for $30,000. And then 50 years later in 2025, that house is worth like $1 million. Imagine instead if your grandparents hadn't bought that house and they put 30,000 US dollars in a shoebox and put that in the attic. in 2025, the shoebox would still have $30,000 of cash in it. And so this is where inflation is kind of like a hidden boss in the first level. And it's not a boss you want to take on right away with your level 1 equipment and stats, because inflation is a serious boss. It plays a trick on you, and this is why it's hidden. Even though the number is the same, $30,000 in 1975 buys you a whole lot more than $30,000 in 2025. And so the lesson here is that we don't want to save all of our money in cash. Now, before we start buying assets left, right, and center, what you do want to do in this stage is create what's called an emergency fund. We'll break this down more in the deep dive video, but really simply, you want to do a budget on your expenses. Look at how much you're paying on rent, on food, on entertainment, on hobbies, etc. And figure out how much you're spending per month. And then set aside an emergency fund, which, depending on your preference, is usually between 3 months to 12 months of expenses. And that becomes your emergency fund. I shared in a recent video how I got diagnosed with cancer, and luckily I'm cancer-free right now, but that is a perfect example scenario where you want to have an emergency fund to pay for a surgery or for a health emergency or a natural disaster. That's why it's called an emergency fund. So you generally want to have that in cash so that's easily accessible, and then everything else we're going to want to start investing. And we're going to get into that in the later levels. But before we get to the fun part of investing our cash and all these fun different assets, we need to go to level 2, which is avoiding financial advisors. It's at this point in your wealth building journey that you're going to enter the existing financial system. You're going to go to a bank, you're going to open a bank account, you'll have a checkings account, a savings account, you might open up some credit cards, and the bank manager is likely going to sell you on having a financial advisor. They're going to tell you something like, hey, have you considered having a financial advisor here at the bank? They only take a 1% fee. You don't pay them anything unless you make money, and it's only 1%. And the huge benefit is that you don't have to worry about your investments. And just like my friend at the beginning of this video, a lot of people out there don't like the stress of thinking about their investments. So that sounds like a great deal, doesn't it? The problem lies in that 1% fee, because it's not just a 1% fee. Let me explain. We're gonna look at 2 examples. We're gonna look at Adam and we're gonna look at Beth. Adam invests $1,000 every single month into the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is the stock market, more specifically, the top 500 biggest companies in the United States. And its average return over the past 100 years is 10% per year, which is phenomenal. Adam is putting $1,000 every month into the S&P 500, and he does this for 40 years. But he does it through a financial advisor. He sends the money to the bank, his financial advisor helps him buy the S&P 500 index, and he pays that 1% fee to the financial advisor. On the other hand, we have Beth. Beth also invests $1,000 every single month into the S&P 500, and she also does it for 40 years. But Beth does not go through a financial advisor. She does it through her brokerage's mobile app, and she does it completely by herself through what's called self-directed investing. And because she's not going through a financial advisor and she's just buying index ETFs straight from her account, index ETFs, by the way, we're going to get to in level 4, she is not paying that 1% fee to her financial advisors. Now we fast forward 40 years. How much more money do you think Beth has than Adam? Some of us might think, well, 1%, because Adam paid a 1% fee. The real answer is 31%. Adam will retire with $4 million. Beth will retire with $5.3 million. And you might be thinking, how is that possible? It was just a 1% fee. The reason for it is compounding. We're going to do many more videos on compounding, including in the deep dive on this particular level. So subscribe to Wealth Potion if you're interested in that. Or you can check out this article I wrote on the Wealth Potion website where I really break down compounding. But in short, compounding is truly magical, and our monkey brains are not designed to truly understand how compounding works. That's why many of us were surprised to hear that Beth made 31% more than Adam, despite only a 1% change in their return every year. And there's a famous quote. It's often attributed to Albert Einstein, although I think that's incorrect. But the quote goes like this: "Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it." Or to bring it back to our example, Adam doesn't fully understand compound interest, but his financial advisor does, so it's his financial advisor that makes $1.3 million off of him. Whereas Beth understands the power of compound interest, and she keeps that additional $1.3 million for herself. And so, to be clear, there are situations where people do gain value from having a financial advisor, but if you're just getting started in your career, especially if you are young, because that means you have the most amount of time ahead of you for compounding to work its magic, you really do not want a financial advisor. And the video game analogy here I like is think of pay-to-win games. There are video games out there where people can pay real money to get an advantage for their character and then beat everyone else. Those are kind of like the financial advisors. They're kind of playing this unfair game, and people generally don't like that. So avoid pay-to-win games, avoid financial advisors, and you will beat level 2. All right, moving on to level 3, we're talking about tax-free accounts. Now, to be honest, doing a deep dive on tax-free accounts is gonna be difficult. And the reason for this is that every country has different tax-free accounts that are available to you. So I'm gonna roughly touch on Canada and the United States, but I highly recommend, regardless of from where you're watching this video from, go on Google, ask ChatGPT or Claude, ask which tax-free accounts you have available to you. Because regardless of exactly what tax-free accounts you have access to, the rule of thumb here is the same, which is you want to maximize these accounts. In a video game, you can think of it as a free money cheat code. And the reason for this is when you invest in something, you achieve something called capital gains. Capital being money and gains being the gain that you have on that asset. So if I buy Bitcoin at $1 10 years ago, and today Bitcoin's worth $100,000, I'm going to be making a capital gain on that Bitcoin when I go to sell it. And the government, they want a piece of that. It'll depend on what country you live in, but it's generally somewhere between 10 to 30%. So it can be quite significant. However, governments, in all of their grace, have given us a vehicle to avoid some of that tax. Another useful analogy here is gardening. Think about a regular brokerage and investment account as a garden. You can plant your seeds there and you can grow some fruits and veggies, but every year winter's gonna come and it's gonna take away some of your crops. It's gonna kill some. There's gonna be pests and rodents. Think of a tax-free account now as a greenhouse. It's protected from animals and insects and the weather. If you have both a garden and a greenhouse, you'd want to put as much of your fruits and vegetables inside the greenhouse to protect it. And just like a greenhouse, these tax-free accounts typically have limits. And that's why to beat level 3, we need to maximize these tax-free accounts. In other words, you want to log into your government website, figure out how much contribution room you have, and then max it out. And be careful because sometimes there's a total limit and then also an annual limit in terms of how quickly you can deposit money into it. So for some real examples, in Canada, there are 3 tax-free accounts. There is the tax-free savings account, or TFSA. There's the Registered Retirement Savings Plan, which is the RRSP, and there's a new one that just came out a few years ago, which is the First Home Savings Account, or FHSA. And so if you're a Canadian, you want to be putting as much money as you can into these accounts. In the United States, there's actually more accounts, and it's a bit more of a complex system, but these are going to be things like your Roth IRA, your Roth 401k, and then your traditional IRA and traditional 401k. So again, this can really differ depending on where you live, but the TLDR here is figure out what tax-free accounts you have available to you, figure out how much room you have in those accounts, and then maximize them as fast as you can. And you might be wondering at this point, okay, I've put money into the account, but it's still cash. What do I buy? How do I start investing? And that brings us to level 4, which is passive investing. We're gonna basically be doing what Beth did in the example earlier. We're gonna be buying investments that will go up in value over time. Now, quick disclaimer, I am not providing financial advice. When it comes to investing, there are an infinite number of strategies and assets that you can buy. There's tons of different stocks all across the world. There's bonds, there's Bitcoin, there's crypto, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can invest your money. But what I'm going to recommend is a strategy that a lot of people in the finance sphere recommend. And that's for a few reasons. 1, it's one of the easiest investing strategies. 2, it's one of the most stress-free investing strategies. And 3, it's one of the best performing investment strategies. And that is what Beth did, buying what's called an index ETF. What is an index ETF? First, we have to understand indices or the index. An example of an index is the S&P 500. It is a list of stocks, essentially. And there's a whole bunch of different ones, but perhaps the most popular is the S&P 500 because it's United States based and it's the largest 500 companies in the stock market. An ETF is an exchange traded fund. Basically a fancy way of saying it's a way of purchasing the entire index without having to go out and individually purchase 500 different companies with equal weightings. Again, I'm going to use an analogy here to make it really simple. Imagine there were 500 different types of fruit at the market. Instead of having to go and weigh the same amount of blueberries and the same amount of watermelon 500 times, you could just go buy a smoothie that they make with all 500 fruits. And that is what an index ETF is. So you're able to quote unquote own all 500 of the companies in the S&P 500 just by buying a single stock, which is the index ETF. Now you might be thinking why you would want to do this. Of course, you could just buy one stock. You could buy Nvidia, and Nvidia has done really well these past few years. However, Nvidia over the past few weeks has kind of plummeted because of this news about DeepSeek and the AI technology out of China. And so imagine if you had all of your money in Nvidia, you would have seen it drop something like 15 to 20% over the past couple of weeks, which would be a lot to stomach. And this brings us back to the beginning, to my friend who doesn't really want to think about his investments. If your investments are making those big swings, it can be very stressful. The short answer on why index ETFs are so powerful is because of diversification. Diversification reduces the risk of your investment portfolio. Basically, the idea of having 500 fruit instead of a single fruit. Now, that explains why it is stress-free. It's also super easy because you literally just need to buy one thing in your brokerage account. And last but not least, it is one of the best performing strategies as well. If you look at hedge funds in the United States, between 2010 and 2020, most hedge funds underperformed the S&P 500. Or to put it another way, you have some of the smartest investors in Wall Street investing money on behalf of millionaires and billionaires, and they cannot beat just buying the S&P 500 and holding on to it. And so this is why I'm actually going to recommend most people should just stop at level 4. To connect this back to video games, level 4 is really like you are playing the game as it was meant to be played. You are making money through your job, you have your emergency fund set up, you're not getting fleeced by a financial advisor, you're minimizing your tax, and you're investing the rest of your money into the S&P 500, and that's growing your wealth 10% every single year. And through compounding, you will absolutely build your wealth. Now, you could stop the video right there. And if you do, thank you for watching, I appreciate you. But you came here for 5 levels of investing. And level 0, Tutorial Island, that doesn't really count. Level 5 is active investing. And again, huge disclaimer here, because we just talked about it. The best hedge funds in the world, many of them do not outperform the S&P 500. Nevertheless, I know regardless of what I tell you, a lot of people out there are going to want to try their hand at active investing, and that's totally fine. I would, however, highly recommend you really get used to level 4 first. Really get to level 4, don't just skip to level 5. This is the important message here. Because level 5, to use a video game analogy, is like the secret hidden boss at the end, or the secret ending where you need to get 100% completion on everything else in order to unlock this kind of Easter egg at the end. Active investing is where a lot of investors can go wrong, right? This is where you can lose money, so you have to be extremely careful. Now, again, I'm not going to review every single active investing strategy out there. I may do that in the deep dive, by the way, but I will share that there is an asset class that not only outperforms the S&P 500 in terms of annual returns, but on a risk-adjusted basis, meaning if you take into account the risk that you're taking by investing in this asset class, you're still better off investing at least a portion of your money into it. And if you've been with Wealth Potion for a while, you probably know what I'm about to say, and that is Bitcoin. Not crypto, but Bitcoin. And if you want to know the difference between the two, you can check out this video. And if you had a bit of an allergic reaction to the term Bitcoin, I would highly recommend looking at it with an objective lens. You might not like the idea. You might associate it with all these other crypto scams, but as many Bitcoiners like to say, math doesn't lie. And if we look at its performance, it has outperformed the S&P 500 massively. And when we look at its Sharpe ratio, which we're not going to get into in this video, on a risk-adjusted basis, it still outperforms. So just because you don't like the idea of Bitcoin does not take away from the fact that it is the best performing investment asset since its inception. I am not saying you should throw all of your money into Bitcoin because I mentioned the example with Nvidia. Bitcoin is way more volatile than Nvidia. It has dropped 50, 60, even 80 or 90% some years. So a lot of people could not stomach that. And by stomach, what I really mean is they will be tempted to sell because they are panicking and they think Bitcoin's going to die. But what I would recommend if you want to hypercharge your investment portfolio is stick with level 4, put say 90, 95% or even 99% of your investments into the S&P 500 and then take 1%, 5% or 10% and put it into Bitcoin. When I was little, I used to play this video game with my dad on the N64. It was called Beetle Adventure Racing. You would drive the, little Volkswagen Beetles and you'd race against other Volkswagen Beetles, and it was a very cute little game. But every so often you would be able to get this nitrous oxide. You get this nitrous oxide and your Volkswagen Beetle would speed and you would be able to pass all the other cars. You might lose control because your car is going so fast, but it would be a great way to speed past others and win the race. You can think of Bitcoin as nitrous oxide. It's maybe not something you're comfortable having on at all times because you could lose control of your car and crash, but if you use it strategically and in the right moments in your investment portfolio, it can hypercharge your investments and it can allow you to achieve your financial goals much faster. So again, I know Bitcoin's not for everyone, especially the volatility that it can introduce into your portfolio, but I highly recommend you look into it and see if there's a way that you can learn about it while you're going on your investment journey. I intend to do deep dives on each of these levels so that you can really flesh them out, especially if you are in one of these levels right now. I really want to lay out a game plan for you to understand the level you're in and help you get to the next level. What level are you in? Let me know in the comments. I would love your feedback. I would love your questions. And if you've made it all the way through, thank you for watching. You're a real one, and I will see you next time.